So, welcome everybody to another episode of Agents of Awesome TV. This is the place to be to meet spiritually savvy people who are out there in the world making our living space and lives a more awesome place to be. So, I would love to introduce you to a dear friend of mine, Merle Conyer. Welcome, Merle.
Thanks, Nicole.
Merle is not only a great friend of mine who I've now known for several years, and she has inspired me in so many ways, and it's been so wonderful to understand the depth of her work layer by layer over the years and get to know what she does even more, even better. So for those of you who haven't met Merle before, Merle is a psychotherapist and a counsellor. And she works at several layers of the individual, community, and society, working especially with trauma, but also social awareness, social activism, and environmentalism. And Merle magically brings together these great areas that are kind of the crises of our times, really. She does this deep work there. And so I'd love to introduce you and welcome Merle to our show.
Thank you very much, and for such a warm welcome too.
So could you tell us a bit, Merle, about this amazing work you do? Because the term trauma and an understanding of trauma has certainly become a bit of a hot topic lately. People are cluing into this as a conversation that we need to be having more of, and we're starting to understand more about the impact of trauma. And certainly we're all, eyes wide open to planetary changes, whether one believes in climate change or not. Aside from that conversation, there are shifts going on. And certainly within the community of people who are waking up, many are feeling quite sensitive to these changes, socially, environmentally, personally. So walk us through a bit about what you do and how you work with people. Yeah.
Certainly. I really need to locate it probably in my own journey, because it's accidental that I found myself here. My early career started as a maths teacher and in senior corporate and government positions. And it was when I started volunteering with asylum seekers about 18 years ago that I experienced a great deal of distress. And so I wanted to find ways to resource myself to be a volunteer. And that led me on a completely unexpected journey, which has become a professional journey about 10 years ago. So I found myself at the intersection of human rights, trauma, justice, and well-being. And it's very deeply informed by my own experience, having grown up in South Africa as a white South African. In my adult years, facing what it means to be conscripted into a racist society, and how those elements are internalised in terms of identity and behaviours and thoughts. And so I needed to go through a very deep process myself of coming to understand what it meant to have been grown up in that way, and to find ways of deconstructing that. And that started happening when I started encountering and working with people who'd experienced profound violations, such as genocide, forced dislocation from their communities, and ongoing suffering when they were seeking protection here in Australia. Very mindful of the difference with me being a migrant who was warmly welcomed, given a job. And the next element that sort of ratcheted up that journey was when I had the real blessing of being invited to walk alongside and work with Aboriginal community. And that has deeply transformed my understanding of what it is to centre relationship with each other as well as with the planet. And I came to experience that through initially doing some work together, through cultural supervision, which deeply informs all my practice. But a really seminal experience in 2013, walking in the Western Australian desert for 12 days with Aboriginal community and coming to experience what it meant to be separated from nature. I wasn't even aware of that separation, but it was walking with traditional rangers and seeing how the children would arrive at each camping spot. We just had our swags, nothing else, and a truck. But the children knew the place as well. They knew the waterholes and they knew the rocks. And for me, it was such an unfamiliar territory. And it was there that I discovered that separation, which was a great source of grief. And then the question, what does it mean, this separation? And what does it mean living in a capitalist, industrial, consumer, individualist society where I am so entangled in those relationships of domination and destruction over nature? What does it mean to return from that profound experience to bring to life some of that awareness within this suburban construct? And that's taken me several years to even start to find the way. So during that time, I've had the real gift of working with people in all sorts of trauma backgrounds. So my primary work at the moment is supporting redress and justice for people who've experienced sexual abuse through institutions. Redress, people supporting members of stolen generations to receive apologies and redress. With lawyers who are working with survivors of profound trauma. So supporting those kinds of teams to be well while they're doing this really important work. I work with individuals who've experienced all forms of trauma and have had to, and whilst that's all through my own practice, and I do it through a combination of counselling, supervision, debriefing, group work, education, consulting. I've also, over the 10 years, have done work in various organisations. So I worked in a women and children centre near the Redfern area of Sydney, which was a profound experience for me to connect with community there, but also with feminist principles and what it means to be a woman who's walking in a world experiencing discrimination and my own trauma through that lineage. And then working with the service which supports survivors of abuse as children. So I've worked with different organisations and privately, but it takes me into all sorts of places. And what I've experienced from that is an understanding that no one is passive in the face of trauma. I've worked in a torture and trauma service as well, for example. There is always a response to trauma, even if that response is not ultimately successful. So the way that I tend to work is to have 2 ears open. The one which is listening with a deep compassion and caring for the suffering that people are subjected to for whatever the reasons may be. It could be through political violence, community violence, institutional violence, interpersonal violence, cultural violence. But I always have a second ear, which is listening for ways people survive, the ways people resist, the way people protest that injustice. And that may be things such as taking good care of themselves after. It may be speaking out for themselves or other survivors. Justice, from my experience, is often not found through the judicial system and indeed may not even offer pathways for some of the profound injustices people experience. So I've become really interested in what does justice look like when that individual who's been subjected to violence and abuse finds a way to make their own way forward where the past will always inform, but it no longer controls. So I become really interested not in what's wrong with the person, but what has happened to them and how they responded. And the one last piece I'll put in, because this may be opening some questions from you, part of my training is as a somatic therapist, as a body-inclusive therapist. I've trained in all sorts of modalities, ecological psychotherapy, narrative therapy, Buddhist psychotherapy, focusing. But I really feel my experience is that when trauma remains unresolved, when there isn't the comfort, the soothing, the truth-telling, the being held to account at the time of trauma, we can hold the remnants of that in our bodies and in our relationships. And so trauma is not over until our bodies, our nervous systems, our sense of safety knows it's over. So I sit with great compassion for people who carry a lineage of profound injustices perpetrated on them, significant violence, removal of safety and care that I believe is our birthright. And I have the real privilege of walking alongside to explore, to acknowledge that and look at what healing looks like and what justice looks like for each person, one person at a time. And I have the honour of being invited to walk alongside those kinds of journeys.
Goodness, Mel, there's so many places we could go with all of that. And for those of you watching, I'm sure you get a sense now of why I just love this woman so much and everything that she's involved with. Deep, 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 deep. I love what you said there, Merle, about really seeing people who have been through sometimes totally extraordinary situations that most of us probably can't fathom. And yet you listen with one ear about that story, but you listen with that other ear about what is that strength that is coming through them as a survivor, as an empowered person to walk in the world. And I think that's such a incredibly valuable approach. And I'd love to hear from you, given all the people that you've met over time. What are some of those core threads that you see that really do? What are some of the common themes of those empowered people and moments? What is it that really pulls someone through the biggest life challenges that we could ever have?
It's a really interesting question. And my first thought is, for each person, it's so individual. So I don't have the overarching description of this is what it is. But these are some of the things that I've found to be helpful for some people. The first is to be witnessed for the isolation, to reduce that isolation, to be witnessed, to be believed, to name the unidirectional nature of violence. We have a culture which all too often blames the victim. And I think there is something really important when we name that unidirectional aspect of violence and where accountability and responsibility sit. So I think that's a really powerful element, particularly in our society, where we hold violence often in secret. It's not spoken, there is not truth-telling, and the victim is often held to blame. So that would be one element. The second element I find is really helpful is to share some of what I've come to learn about what happens in our bodies and nervous systems when trauma remains unresolved. Because, we will have all had experiences if we've reached your or my age and stage. We're all carrying experiences of one thing or another. And we will have experiences where something happens and we have this huge reaction, which seems maybe out of context. But that kind of thing starts becoming really understandable when there is insight into what happens actually in the nervous system and in the body and the brain when we're subjected to trauma. And Dan Siegel, who's one of the leading practitioners in the area, I love a statement of his which says, when you can name it, you can tame it. So one thing that I love doing is sharing some of what I've discovered, because then those crazy making feelings suddenly all make sense. And when we kind of know what's happening with our wiring, we can take steps to make other choices around that, to bring healing to those areas of disruption and pain. So I'm informed very much by body work, but also by the neuroscience. And the two of them come together with contemplative traditions and the wisdoms of contemplative traditions. They come together and really provide for me a breakthrough potential in understanding what we experience and how we can take steps to heal it. So what that means is that when we use the word healing, it's not that the past is obliterated, but there's a way of integrating that experience so it no longer hijacks the way that we feel. Because one of the things about unresolved trauma is we lose the distance and the separation between present and past. Something will happen and we'll have this big reaction because we're still wired according to what happened in the past. So when we're able to bring that healing, we're able to be much more grounded in the today, which gives us many more possibilities going into the future. That would be another area. A third area would be relationship. Relationship is also informed by the neuroscience. There's wonderful work by Stephen Porges over the last 25 years that has described how we've actually got a social nervous system. That there are actually
that's
two
nice.
ways we try and control this high arousal. The one is we can try and slam on the brakes, which isn't over a long period of time, doesn't really look after us well. But there's also a slow way of coming back to safety, and that's through safe relationships. And so that's where I think the therapeutic relationship can offer real potential for healing when we're able to feel a sense of safety in ourselves and bring that kind of safe relational experience. And to recognise, though, that healing will primarily take place out of the therapy room. So it's about understanding and acknowledging all the relational connections in a person's life and respecting them and honouring them. And they can be very wide. They could be relationships to other people, to pets, to nature, to spiritual practice, to community. There's all sorts of ways of being in a relationship that can bring a sense of calm to our nervous system. That would be another area. And possibly the fourth one, and this one sometimes can take a while for some people to find, is self-compassion and forgiveness. So one of the things that happens when we're subjected to profound violence, our brain can shut down all but the basic survival responses, which means we are immobilized, which means we can't necessarily fight back. And sometimes you can't if there's such a power imbalance anyway, but there is also this mechanism in the brain that when we are so overwhelmed by fear, we shut down and become immobilized. And we've all seen it with things like possum, playing possum. That's a shutdown response, which is such a terrified response. And I find many people castigate themselves, why didn't I fight back? Why did I allow that to happen? But when you look at it from the adult that the person may be now, if they're a child, they have no capacity to fight back. Or if they were immobilized, it was actually their brain trying to keep themselves as safe as they can in the situation because it was such an overwhelming experience, so profoundly painful, that we have this shutdown effect. And so it's also about acknowledging how power plays out and how the biology plays out, which in time, I think, can support people to recognise that they actually did the best they could with the resources they had at the time, and to bring compassion to the suffering that they may have been carrying. So that journey around self-compassion and forgiveness changes then the conversation in a really profound way. Those are just some of the initial thoughts I had.
It's just some of them. This is marvelous, and I find that so important as well, acknowledging people wherever they are in their journey, that chances are everyone's just doing the best that they have been able to do at any given point in time. And especially when we're bringing content from childhood, kids are kids and kids are just doing their best at that time. And the wisdom that the body has to be able to simply gently and calmly hold some of those things for a
Yeah.
time in our life when we're more ready. Like you say, when we have more calmness and safety and stillness around us, so that those pieces can be moved through a bit more. Yeah, so important.
But additionally, when we're older, we've also got more resources of other sorts. We may have income, we may have a safe house, we may have a safe relationship. Perhaps the perpetrator has died, or other things have changed in the family context. There's more acknowledgement perhaps in society. We've got more intellectual capacity and different ways of making meaning. So those also add sometimes. But I think you're right. I think that there are times when these journeys open up and we have more resource and more capacity. But I find it's like an artichoke. You can do really deep work, and then a little while later, the next leaves open, and the next leaves open. And I like to use the metaphor of the artichoke because at the centre of the artichoke is the heart.
Mm.
And it's got a lot of prickles on the outside. But it's an opening journey. It's a spiral of a journey. There's not a destination. It's about where we are when we have support, when we feel resourced, we feel ready. Yeah.
So let's shift gears, Merle, to the collective and the planet and what's happening right now in the bigger picture, but also because it affects us as individuals in our lives. You know, you mentioned in your story of your own awakening moment where you're out there and you're connecting to nature in a whole new way, which gave you the realization that you actually hadn't connected in that way before, unlike these kids who grew up in this environment and they just knew how to navigate it. And the grief that you said that came with simply acknowledging growing up as a cultural product within a capitalist society where we are disconnected. We are these little capsules. We have now come to a time on this planet where that very much is the driving force of how we are moving forward as a progressive society. And yet there are pockets of people who are yearning and hungering and who have even made attempts to step off the grid as much as possible to have these deeper connections with Earth. They are in permaculture. They are living in the earth ships. They are, you know, out in the forest. They are shifting eating habits and relational habits. And often people are having, this is connected to their spirituality and their awakening that is going on as a part of this, because they're spiritually feeling connected to the planet and nature, and, you know, that helps them relate to themselves. So I guess I'd love to hear from you, your perspective and what's going on there.
Going on, when you say there, what do you mean by there?
I guess what's going on there? What's going on in our times right now with, you know, the as we're getting into an ecological crisis in many ways, and at the same time people are opening up to that and choosing to live differently within it. Yeah.
I'm following it. So I'm still, you know, finding my way around this really big topic, but I do have some perspectives that are really strengthening the more and more that I delve. I last year I went back and looked at some of the original scientific papers. So I was interested to ask the question, you know, what is informing the statements we're hearing about global warming or global heating, and what is the consensus around it? And certainly from the information that I've read is that the world is too hot. It's already causing profound damage to every country on every continent. It is overwhelmingly due to our misuse of planetary resources, and that this has a consensus of almost all climate scientists. We've seen just in the last few weeks, with the IPC bringing out their latest report, suggesting that there's a really small window to bring about radical change. to change a trajectory that will take us into catastrophic conditions. And then even more recently, of an indication that over 1 million species are at risk of extinction, including within recent upcoming decades, if we don't change that particular trajectory. There's also work that's coming out from people like Jen Bendell that's starting to look at the patterns of food production, for example, in Europe and Russia, and how they are being radically shifted and raising questions around what does this mean for our continuation of our society within a period of even 10 years away. So the place that I find myself, Nick, as I read this various information is that awakening up that our industrial lifestyle has primarily caused it. While weather and climate has changed over the years, the trajectory of change in the last 50 years has absolutely no precedent. The other thing is, which is a place which has really catapulted me to action, is there's a very deep intersection with the kind of work that I do, in that whilst it's us, primarily the wealthy countries that contribute most of the emissions, it's the poorest countries, it's people already in places that are marginalised that will experience the greatest effect. So there is not an equal distribution. And my research has shown, for me, what's really devastating predictions. And as I say this, I want to sort of say to you and to whoever might be watching this, that this information can be really hard to hear. So I'm kind of sitting here holding and wondering what I will share, recognising that this is an opportunity to respond with honesty and frankness based on my own journey of exploration. And mindful that it could be received with some people a sense of shock, with others with relief that it's been named. So we will hold that together, recognising this is really difficult information. But, you know, when I looked at where the impacts will fall and where they're already falling, it's primarily poor women of colour who are going to bear the brunt for all sorts of reasons. Because of what will be required for them to risk their own safety in order to be able to feed their families within the social construct of some of the poorer countries. There is already a well-established correlation between violence against women and hotter temperatures. Children are far more at risk living in unsettled conditions for their basic safety. Older people are more vulnerable. People who've already got pre-existing mental health and physical health conditions, there is a direct correlation between the escalation of that as well as the destabilisation of some of the medications at higher temperatures, which lead to higher hospitalisation. People who are already in vulnerable situations through war, this will be amplified when there is struggle over resources. So the war in Syria had as one of its inputs the devastating drought and the way that then shifts population. And so there are links between safety and violence in immediate communities as well as in large-scale conflict. And then there's population groups like scientists who are carrying the knowledge of what so many people are not willing to hear or to respond to, and outdoor labourers, tourist operators, farmers, others whose livelihood is tied. So I really feel from a trauma point of view, we are all being subjected to a profound trauma with the ongoing industrial practices that are ultimately destroying the life support system that all of us rely on. So I think that we're needing to hold this from that place of trauma, but to recognise that individuals are not to blame. It's no one's fault. None of us intended it to be this way. It's no one's fault, not for us to blame an individual or to blame each other. But I think the journey is to acknowledge what the science is very clearly telling us and what the trends of hotter weather are showing us. And that does then bring us to a place potentially of profound grief. Because when we think about species going extinct, for example, it means that we're going to be moving into a time of mourning and heartbreak. And so it starts to ask questions like, where are the places of hope? And how do you live with heartbrokenness? And what does it call on us to be human beings at this point in time? So I listened to a beautiful conversation between Joanna Macy and Jem Bendell just last week. Joanna's been doing environmental work for 45 more years, and Jem Bendell I've already mentioned. And her response when Jem asked, how is it for you as a 90-year-old? She wants to live for as long as she can. Isn't this an incredible time to be human? What potential is there for us to think about? What does it mean to care for each other and care for the earth, and to move us out of what she called a demented economic system? So what my view is that what we're dealing with here is a cultural, economic, political and religious set of doctrines that have separated people like myself who've grown up in these Western industrialized contexts. And our actions through being connected to these systems and these cultures have inevitably brought us to this place. So I sit here with two questions really. The first is, what does it call on us to step up to do? And you've mentioned some of the people who are choosing to re-enchant their connection with nature, to live close to nature, to live in ways which honour nature, which are sustainable, which restore. And the other is, as we're moving into this era of great loss, inevitable, whatever major actions may or may not be taken, how do we, that will bring up all sorts of feelings. It'll bring up grief and loss and shock and dread, panic. But if we're unable to feel into those feelings, we will then shut down. And so what is it that we can do to care for ourselves and care for each other? That we can be present to what is unfolding and not turn away from the things that are so hard to face, or to avoid them, to avoid the feelings. And so I think that's some of our work going forward, and it's work we have to do collectively. This is work where in community we need to sit together, we need to draw on our rituals and traditions, art practices, we need to find ways and learn from each other, re-inspire ways of being in the world. And there is a great potential that becomes possible in terms of us being able to reimagine a world. So I think we have to hold both of those, these places of active hope, and I'm happy to share a bit more about what I mean by active hope, and also these places of acceptance and what it means to be, this is now our life's work, this is not going away, this is our life's work. How do we be present and full-hearted and honour and acknowledge and mourn and grieve what it is that's going to be transpiring? So, and we need collective care. We can't do this alone. And so I think it's calling on us to be in the world in quite different ways.
Yeah, I agree with you completely there. I mean, we're at a time where we need to walk eyes wide open through what's occurring. And you're right, there's nothing easy about that. And the more one continues to walk and keep those eyes open, the more shocking the information is, the experiences are, and it takes a lot of strength and resilience to keep stepping forward and stepping up, knowing the responsibility becomes greater as well the more one comes to know about situations. I guess it's always possible to become an ostrich and bury your head in the sand, and that is one response, but does it change anything?
Mm.
And yeah, there's several terms you mentioned there too. Re-enchantment with nature as one stream. Can you elaborate for us, Mel? What does that mean to you, a re-enchantment with nature?
Well, that's still my journey to really fully discover that. But it's the opposite from separation. It's opposite from the place I found myself in 2013, was with not even knowing separate. So, you know, my sense of that re-enchantment is when there is that deep embodied knowing and connection of a Mother Earth with a heartbeat, of recognizing that the trees and the plants and the rocks and the animals and the birds are our brothers and our kin. They're brothers and sisters, they're kin. It's about establishing a kinship connection. It's, you know, we have the blessing of the wisdoms of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities in this country. And I feel that if we would be willing to listen, there is much that we can learn about what re-enchantment with nature might look like. It's a visceral, deep visceral, relational, respectful, interdependent, honouring experience where we are no longer assume that idea of dominion over or the right to extract resources, but we step into an ecological flow where we become part of an ecosystem. And so it's moving away from that hierarchy, which has led to the destruction, to far more interconnected, circular ways of being in contact. But as I said to you, I know I've still got a long way to go in my own journey around the embodied understanding of what that means. But that is one of the lodestars that is calling me and guiding me. But the inquiry, the exact question that you asked me, what does that mean? I'm wondering what it means to you.
Re-enchantment with nature. Yeah, for me, it's a very body-centered. It's animistic. You know, it's being at one with the natural environment and being part of it, and exactly as you say, part of that interconnected system. And that word enchantment for me has a magical quality. It's experiencing and being with the life force energy that is all around. So through the living world, and I mean, I grew up in a Japanese tradition where that is part of their way of being, is to understand that the rock has spirit, the water has spirit, the air has spirit, everything around has a life force energy, and we are simply part of that system. So an enchanted, that to me is an enchanted way of being within. And I don't think it's hocus pocus nonsense. I think it's a deep attunement to a vibrational reality that is in place. It's simply a matter of tapping into that and staying present to that. Yeah. And I agree with you completely that our Indigenous pathways of knowing and our Indigenous living wisdoms right now hold the keys to that, to so much of that memory that we as humans, particularly as modern humans, have totally lost contact with. Yeah, and often by no fault of our own. As soon as you pave the roads with concrete and we put on rubber soles down the bottom of our feet, I mean, we've already lost layers of connection there with a pulsing earth and the worms and the roots and all those information systems at play.
Yeah, there's all other ways we lose connection. For example, even the idea was, I don't know if this is the same for you, but I grew up, we were told, go and throw away the rubbish. Well, you know, there is no way. So the other thing is to recognise the circular nature and how we can, through our own choices, interrupt that kind of disregard for what a way might look like. So I do think that there are places that we can start. I think there's a lot of agency we have to, deeply examine. So one of the things that I think about in my own life, and I've got a huge way to go, I think about what would it mean to decarbonise my home and decarbonise my work environment. Now, I've got to do so much research to even figure what that looks like. But I think it's when we set those kinds of overarching questions and go and start inquiring, that when we take those kinds of actions, it starts to bring us a little bit closer. It's about action, it's about commitment, it's about doing things. And it will require us to give away some old habits. But I do think that's one of the things that, for me, I look at with great curiosity. This is a time potentially of those unwholesome structures falling away. And there is the potential for something else. So that's where I've had to go through a great examination in terms of my own sense of what does hope mean. Reading some of these statistics, I've been up and down slippery dips. So I've had to do some very careful contemplation about what do I think about hope at this time. And I've come to a position now which I can share with you, which may change. But I decided I cannot accept despair because of my responsibility to the next generation. So not having hope is not an option. And therefore I turned to the work of Joanna Macy again and Chris Johnston, who authored a book a few years back called Active Hope, where they talk about hope as a verb. Hope is not something you have. Hope is something you do. So it's about thinking about what is the kind of world that you would like to be present, and then taking steps to act towards that without knowing what the consequences will be of your actions, when, where and who it might affect. But it's about walking an ethical way in alignment with those values and ethics. So hope becomes something you do, which means you can still have active hope even when you feel despair. Rebecca Solnit speaks similarly on this. She said, you can feel utter despair and you can still go and elect people who are climate advocates in Parliament, for example. Not quite her words, but similar concept. So that's the one area where I kind of rest my own resilience on, that I have got choice whether to be hopeful or hopeless. And I'm going to choose this idea of active hope, which is linked with action, because it's about the present. But the second is amazing transformations have happened. I've come out of the apartheid system, which crumbled. We've seen the wall in Germany crumble. There have been, instances of dramatic change. And I've been reading the work of Erica Chenoweth, who researched around violent and non-violent campaigns. And her research has suggested that if you have 3.5%, just 3.5% of the population actively mobilised, it almost inevitably brings about the change that they're advocating for.
3.5%.
3.5%. I've got a great video TED talk from memory that I recommend, which sort of summarises some of the work. So therefore, that's the other place I place a sense of hope, that there is no idea what might transpire if we are concerted in our actions. And there is the possibility for a profound transformation. Our culture is not serving us well. It's not serving the world well. We cannot continue with this culture. I, for one, am really happy to let it go. It's going to bring about, it's not going to be an easy path, but there is a potential for something else that is more generative if we find that re-enchantment with the natural world and we re-find our place within it. So those are the places that I hold my sense of stability. At the same time, at the moment of deeply exploring what does it mean to live with brokenheartedness, and how do we bring grieving into our individual and collective lives. Because I think that's the key to stay well. We need to express these feelings. And so that's an area of inquiry for me right at the minute. Now, that's a lot that I'm sharing, and this might be quite a heavy conversation. So I just want to check in.
I think this audience can handle it, Merle. You know, this is a conversation of, you know, for and of agents of awesome, who are people who are aware and open to the current predicaments that we live with in this world. It's not fanciful thinking and nonsense. It is very eyes wide open to the current crises, however they seem to wherever these people are in the world. And really, an agent of awesome is someone who within that is able to connect in with what actions, exactly as you're talking about there, what actions can be taken within that context that work with the individual skills, that work and make sense in their communities, that are in alignment with who they are and who they are becoming and where they are. And so it's totally in line with what you're talking about, you know, and I so appreciate the depth that you're bringing to this conversation, because it can be very challenging to sit with one's discomfort, to acknowledge it and to sit with it. But you bring a voice of hope to that, to say that is possible to do and acknowledge whilst walking through that fire into something different, into a new kind of world that is possible as what is not working falls away.
May I perhaps offer some other thoughts of sustenance that have just around that as well?
Please.
You know, there's some incredible things that are happening, and we hear so much of the doom and gloom, and I do feel it's important, as you say, we face it and walk it. But I think that it's also relevant to hold inspiration. So I'll share with you a couple of things. Like, have you heard about the Great Green Wall of Africa? So, you know, started in 2007, 20 African countries are planting trees from one side of the continent to the other, to hold back the Sahara Desert. And it's the place where the earth is getting the hottest. And they're already 15% along the way, and there's already all sorts of benefits with biodiversity coming into the places, fresh drinking water coming to the aquifers, jobs for the local villagers. Now imagine that, to plant a wall of trees from one end of the continent to another. Then there's a high-tech example in Myanmar. So mangroves. When we look at what's needed, you know, there's one of the things that is needed is actually to draw down the carbon. And mangroves draw down carbon at 40 times the rate of forests. So there is and Myanmar is one of the countries most vulnerable to the effects of climate change. They are using drones to plant trees because of the volume that's needed. And what I've been reading is the intention is to train up 2 local people to operate a fleet of 10 drones, and in one day they can plant 400,000 trees.
Wow.
And this is an invention by an Australian woman. And her vision is to use drones to plant 1 billion trees in a year. So there are these dramatic examples. Then there's other examples for me that really inspire around how we hold and honour what's happening. So I've been following the work of a woman called Trebi Johnson, who talks about radical joy. So she talks about how she was walking on the Appalachian Trail to a place she loved, and it had been completely destroyed, decimated, left after zinc mining. And she asked the question, what do we do with land that's been destroyed like that? Do we reject it? How do we stay in relationship with that? And so she's created this practice of radical joy, of actually going to the places which have been destroyed and re-establishing relationship. And it could be offering ritual or ceremony or apology, and then using objects on the land to create an artifact of beauty. So to continually find our agency to bring beauty into those kinds of places. There are other communities that have what's known as a bell of lost species. And each time a species is announced extinct, a bell rings. Or they come together on the 30th of November, which is the International Day of Extinction of Species, and a roll call occurs as the bells ring. So these are really, they land in my belly as well. I see your face. That's facing the loss, but it's a way where we don't stand powerless or silent, and we can come together, we can feel that we can support each other. You know, we started the conversation around trauma at the beginning, and trauma is so often held in silence, and we can only heal in relationship. So I'm becoming really interested in how people are collectively coming together and doing astonishing things to create different relationships with the earth, through regenerative farming, through the kinds of examples you gave, or through massive initiatives to restore ecosystems. And then also how we come together to acknowledge the losses and to feel it. Because I think when we can feel the grief of that, that reconnects us, and that becomes a sign of deep caring, which in turn can be galvanized into action. So it can become the source of our energy. You talked about, one of the things is we can just shut it down. When we shut that down, we also shut down everything else. We shut down joy. We shut down other capacity for relationship. I think we actually shut down the capacity for full vitality and well-being. So there is this interesting dialectic, from my experience, that when we open to that suffering, we also open to more joy and to more relationship and to more creativity.
And I love what you say there too, for people to, to please not despair and go out and connect with others, go to where there is movement and aliveness around the topics that most speak to us, because there we will find the healing in being with other people and acknowledging it, and the hope and the momentum that something is actually going forward from there. The solution can be found in those pockets.
Yeah. So definitely, I think it's about going out and finding those connections. And I think it's also for us to start having conversations in our own circle. Not just to gently ask people sometimes questions like, what do you think about the state of the world? What are you most concerned about in the future? And where there is interest, to sit together and explore what you both are seeing and hearing about and thinking about, and to talk about the enormity of what's being faced. It's just about starting those conversations. It's about breaking the silence. And then, yes, it's that connection, connecting to others. That's Bill McKibben, I love the way he says it. He says that this is a time that requires, radical responses. And the most important thing that any of us can bring to it is to become less of an individual. And to join
to become what, sorry?
Less of an individual and join with others. So I think for me that's an anchor when we think about where do we start. I think it's exactly what you said. Think about who can I go and sit with and talk with and connect with. How can I be less of an individual? I think that's the place to start. Because it's this, and that's where I think Western psychology has contributed to all of this. It's because we've seen ourselves as individuals. Because we've seen ourselves disconnected from an ecosystem of community and an ecosystem of the natural world that we've landed in this place. So I think part of the healing and part of the agency comes when we say, how can I be less of an individual? What step might I take with that today?
Merle, what is most alive for you right now as you step forward? You're immersed in big bodies of work and big conversations, and you have the privilege of seeing behind the curtain of many types of conversations that are happening institutionally as well as personally. So I guess where is the aliveness for you right now? Where is the excitement? Where is this going for you?
I don't know where it's going. But certainly what's giving me energy and gratitude is sitting in community with others who are not shying away from looking and sitting together. And there is something relieving in a way, because it's like we live a double life. We kind of know something's happening, but we just live our lives the way that we always live. And there is something quite relieving to have that stripped away and to kind of face what's going on. That actually gives me strength and aliveness. It's a curious paradox, isn't it?
Yeah, it's wonderful. It's wonderful. So it's time to come out. It's time to talk about things. It's time to share. And in doing that, we find how to take step forwards to address.
Yeah. And I'd say the second thing is I have my own clinical supervisor who's a very dear man. The very first time we met, which is 3.5 years ago, before I was even having the kinds of conversations I'm having with you now about the land and nature, he said to me, in relation to the work around trauma, he said to me, tell me about joy in your life. You can't do this work without joy. Joy is your birthright. Tell me about joy in your life. And so I think that's the other part, the other route is for us to find our places of joy and beauty and spirituality. That's what's going to sustain us, and that is our birthright. And I think, Kate Marvel is a climate scientist who says, from what I've read of her, she says it's not hope we need, it's actually courage. It's courage to walk this path with grace and a broken heart. It's a courage to walk this path as a full human being in all our aliveness. And so I think that's the other part, Nick, is for us to, even perhaps bigger, to amplify, to find those ways of connecting to spirit and joy and beauty and really treasure them.
Absolutely. And I love that you remind that this is a birthright. This is a birthright. Yes.
Well, that's the gift that was given to me, which I share with you now. Yeah.
I love
to remember that too, to make the time in this space, because we're in this for the long haul. And I think it's important we don't overlay it with the industrial complex of working really hard and trying to get really productive and get all these outcomes. There is something about that self-care is a radical act at this moment in time. The way we approach it is the way that we hope to transform things. And so I think that's a wider conversation which takes us into places of beauty, of joy, of solitude, of nurturing our spaces of calm. That's needed. That is so much needed at this time as well.
What a wonderful note to wrap on, that self-care and love of nature and being with an appreciation of an elevation of beauty are radical acts that are essential for our health and for our survival as a species.
And collective care, that we don't have to do it on our own. With that collective care for each other.
Beautiful. Merle, how can people connect with you and find out more about what you do, aside from links that we will add somewhere down below?
I'll send you a couple of links. I don't yet have a website, so I'll send you a couple of links, and that will be the way to do it.
Perfect. So for those who are wanting, who love what Merle is on about, and perhaps if you're a professional in the field, or you're someone who even works at an organizational or collective level, with larger communities, who could do with somebody that can help stimulate certain conversations around what we've touched on today, Merle is certainly your lady. And Merle, thank you for your depth of love and sharing and the information. And I just know through your words you've sat deeply with all of this for so long, and there is such care in what you bring forward, and it's just beautiful to be part of. So thank you for sharing.
Thanks. Thank you, Nick. It's been a real joy sitting with you. Thank you for the space to share the ideas and for what you bring into the world through your sparks of beauty.
So everyone, until we next connect, stay radical, stay awesome, connect with your communities, and reclaim that birthright of joy. See you all later.